There you
Good
are.
morning.
Hi
Good morning,
there.
Laura, and everybody else. I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah. So, Dr. Charles Brown is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Tulsa. He's published over 200 papers, books, and monographs, and his work on cliff swallows was recognized with his receiving the Elliott Coues Award from the AOS in 2009 and the Exemplar Award from the Animal Behavior Society in 2001. And you are also an author or co-author on several Birds of the World species accounts. Do you want to tell me which ones those are?
I have authored or co-authored the purple martin, the barn swallow, the violet green swallow, and of course, the star of the show today, the cliff swallow.
Right. So your expertise goes far beyond the swallows, far beyond the cliff swallows into several other species. So it's great to have you here. And judging by the response, the registrations to this webinar, as we know, swallows and swifts really capture the human spirit and the imagination more than many other bird species. And I wondered what inspired you to take on cliff swallows as your sort of passion species.
I became most interested in this animal because it is so social.
Hmm.
It is one of the most social land birds. Tricolored blackbird used to have that distinction, but I'm not sure it does anymore with its decline. But during the breeding season, cliff swallows are just so social, and they do everything together.
Hmm.
And in many ways, they're unlike most North American birds.
Hmm.
And there's so many questions that you can ask about social animals, fundamental questions about group living, the evolution of cooperation, the costs of group life, all of these sorts of things that apply to so many different sorts of social animals can be so well studied in cliff swallows. And the large colonies mean that you can get large sample sizes. They're very accessible. So it's just been a fantastic animal to study for anyone interested in social evolution.
Great, great. Well, we look forward to listening to your talk today. So if you could just turn on your video, that would be great.
Okay, I think we're ready to go.
We are, yes.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for this opportunity to talk today about this fabulous bird and the work we've been doing over the last 45 years. I became interested in this animal in graduate school and have been working on it ever since. What I want you to try to take away today from the talk is that social behavior is constantly changing in response to both environmental change and evolutionary challenges
Mhm.
as environments and novel aspects of the environment appear. So what we've been seeing in cliff swallows is just what we thought we saw in the 80s, which was true in the 80s, in many cases is not the case today because we're seeing these shifts in behavior and ecology. And that's what I hope you take away from what I talk about today. We're going to just hit some of the highlights and but I again I wanted to emphasize this ecological these ecological shifts that we're seeing. Okay, well, oh, okay, here we go. All right, two major questions that my research has revolved around during the last 45 years. One of these is why do cliff swallows form colonies in the first place? Why are these animals social? The other major question that I've focused on, perhaps even more so, is I try to understand the causes and consequences of variation in group size. because with cliff swallows, as with all social animals, we see a wide range in group sizes, from some that are not particularly social to ones that occur in colonies of thousands. And what leads to this sort of variation, and what are the consequences of living in a small versus a large colony? And that was sort of what I began with in graduate school, owing to a study on this particular species. This is the bank swallow. And in the 1970s, a pioneering study on bank swallows was done by John Hoagland and Paul Sherman in Michigan, in which they went to bank swallow colonies that are located in the sides of these sandy bluffs, and they found colonies of different sizes. And they looked at any number of benefits and costs that might apply to group living. And they were able to measure them in colonies of different sizes. And this was a truly pioneering approach that no one had used at that point. And so I read this paper in graduate school, and I was just sort of hooked on using natural variation in group size to examine the evolution of social living. So I went on and I became John Hoagland's graduate student, and he suggested that I work on cliff swallows. Now, the cliff swallow is a bird of the western United States primarily, although there are populations, smaller populations east of the Mississippi. The birds historically probably occurred in the Sierras and the Rockies and the foothills of those areas on natural cliff nesting sites, hence the name of the bird. They're distinguished by the white forehead patch and the square tail and the orange rump. They're sometimes confused with barn swallows, which also build mud nests and nest in some of the same types of habitat. But at least historically, cliff swallows were typically place their nests underneath a horizontal ledge on the side of a steep cliff. And this is a present day colony that the birds still use on occasion. You notice the closely packed nests, so they often share walls with each other. Sharing walls has a lot of consequences. It's easy for parasites to move between nests. It's easy for individuals to monitor their neighbors and see what their neighbors are doing and possibly steal from their neighbors. They're also able to gain information from their neighbors on where food may be found. So this extremely dense nesting has many consequences for their social evolution. Now, I talked about how social they are. They're very social in everything they do. They feed in groups, and we'll talk about that later. Here are some gathering wet mud for their nests in groups. They migrate in groups. They spend the winter in southern South America in groups as well. So highly social at all times of the life cycle. Again, unlike many other North American birds. So our cliff swallow, the one in North America, is one of 8 Petrochelidon swallows that are found worldwide. Um, Ours is the only one that has been studied to any real degree, but they all share some basic similarities. They all have a lightish rump, which may be important in social feeding. They all build mud nests, and they are social to various degrees. Our cliff swallow, the Indian cliff swallow, and possibly the South African cliff swallow are the most social, form the largest colonies. Now, the cliff swallow is well known for its mythical return to San Juan Capistrano each year. This is this is sort of a modern day legend, and it's a bit of a metaphor for the repeated occurrence of natural events. So the legend is the birds return to Mission San Juan Capistrano on the same day each year, March 19th. It's strictly a myth. The birds don't return on the same day, and in fact, very few nest there at the present time. But if most people know anything about cliff swallows, they'll know, well, that's the one that returns to San Juan Capistrano. Our work is done in western Nebraska. This is an area which I am convinced is the best place in the world for cliff swallows. They are more abundant. There are more colonies. There are more colonies of different sizes in this area along the North and South Platte rivers than any place I've seen in North America. So our work is done over a span of about 150 miles from Broadwater, Nebraska in the west to just east of North Platte in the east. Most of our colony sites are associated with the either the North Platte or the South Platte River. So they're in the river valleys, typically because that's where either the cliff nesting sites are or that's where the majority of the artificial structures are located. So this is Nebraska. This is, of course, what many people think of when they think of Western Nebraska. And there are aspects of Western Nebraska that look like this. I think it's a beautiful place. It's my favorite place on Earth, even though I didn't know anything about it until I began studying uh, cliff swallows. But there is more to Western Nebraska than open fields. And in particular, the one of the attractions has been the existence of a biological field station in Western Nebraska, the Cedar Point Biological Station, which is run by the University of Nebraska, is located near Ogallala. And this field station hosts researchers. It also has classes that come in and field classes are done. And its location, it's centrally located to hundreds of cliff swallow colonies. So it was really a stroke of luck that I found this biological station in this ideal place to study cliff swallows. And that has largely probably contributed to the study being very long term. Now, within the study area, there are natural cliffs that the birds use, referred to earlier. This is one in the Ash Hollow area, which was right along the Oregon Trail. There are accounts of Oregon Trail immigrants that observed cliff swallows on these natural cliffs in this particular area. So the birds have always occurred in the North and South Platte valleys, but undoubtedly they were their populations were much smaller prior to the construction of artificial structures that the birds now use for nesting sites, such as this bridge over the North Platte River. And you can see all of these nests that are packed up underneath And colonies like this, a big bridge like this, may have 3,000 or more nests. So many of the birds are now using these highway bridges. Now, some still use natural sites. This is one in our study area, but they've shifted to the point now that a large colony like this on a natural site is very unusual. Most of the birds now are underneath these concrete bridges. You can see here almost all the available substrate is used here. There's very little room for any more nests. They also use highway culverts, which are these box-shaped structures for drainage. These have been really important research sites because you can just walk right into them, number the nests with chalk on the wall. Easy to catch birds in sites like this. So really um, a really easy bird now to work on since they abandoned the natural sites. I tried to do some stuff with them on natural sites in the first year and about got killed. So we've shifted our focus to these type places. Now, one point I want to make is that um, Puff swallows occur in colonies of very widely different sizes. And this is one reason this particular part of Nebraska has been such a wonderful research area. So you can see here, this is a frequency tabulation of colonies, and this is the number of nests. So there are single nest colonies and one's up to more than 3,000 nests. And the biggest one we have is 6,000. And the mean is about 400 nests. But you can see that you have colonies of all of these different sizes. So like the early Hoagland and Sherman bank swallow work, this study provides sort of a natural laboratory to look at group size and the evolution of group size. Okay, so let's talk about some of the disadvantages of living in groups. And there are a number of those, and I show just four of them here. And I want to highlight these first two because these two, all social animals have to deal with these costs of sociality. One of these is the increased transmission of parasites and disease. If you're in a bigger group or if you're around more individuals, you have a greater likelihood of contracting a parasite or a pathogen from other group members. And we know this all too well in our post-COVID world. But this applies to all animals because all animals have parasites and pathogens. And increased competition for resources is also a universal cost of living in groups. So we've looked at all of these and others for cliff swallows, but I want to focus on this first one, increased transmission of parasites and disease, because we think this is probably the most important cost of living in groups. So this was one of the very early ones that we began to study in the 1980s. The primary parasite that cliff swallows encounter is this nasty looking thing. This is the swallow bug. And if you think it looks like a human bed bug, you're right, because it's about the same size as a human bed bug. It has many ecological similarities to human bed bugs, but this particular one only parasitizes cliff swallows. So like bed bugs, they live in the substrate. So they live in the nest or on the outside of the nests. They come onto the host at night to feed, and then they drop off. So they don't essentially travel with the cliff swallows at all times, but they live in the nests. And consequently, the numbers of these insects can build up over time at cliff swallow colonies. Now, they are blood suckers. So this shows two that are feeding on this nestling cliff swallow. So they get very engorged, and it, it's it's easy when the babies are small like this to actually see how many are feeding on the babies. Now, I should point out that we know that some nests alone can have up to 2,000 bugs, and that's a single nest. And so we've taken nests down and we've counted all of the bugs there. But early on, we used the number of bugs on babies as an index so that we could get a sense of how parasitism in these animals changed with group size. Because if it is a cost of group living, we would expect more of these parasites in the larger colonies. And that's what we found. Some of the early data in which we were counting the bugs per nestling per nest. And the babies were all taken out at a standard time, 10 days of age, and we counted how many were on them. And this gave us a relative index of swallow bug parasitism with cliff swallow colony size. And so what you see is the larger colonies had more bugs. And this is a common pattern that's been documented in social animals. But this was early on, this was sort of a neat thing. We were able to show, yeah, there are more bugs in these larger colonies. And we also asked, okay, there are more bugs in the larger colonies. Well, how does this increase happen? There's got to be some mechanism for having more bugs in um, in these larger colonies. And one mechanism that we investigated was the introduction of bugs into colonies by the birds. Now you recall I said that swallow bugs generally live in the nests, but at certain times in their life cycle, they move around and they get onto the birds themselves and they will move from colony to colony. And that's shown here. This is a bird we caught in a mist net, and here is a swallow bug on its foot. And sometimes a single bird may have 15 or 16 of these swallow bugs that are hanging on to the feet. So we discovered that the cliff swallows themselves carry swallow bugs on their feet and they introduce them to new colonies. We had some indication that there were probably more birds passing through a colony site, particularly the larger colonies. And as more birds pass through the site, we might expect more bugs to be introduced. So we did an experiment, and that's what we found. We estimated the immigrant bugs um, per week per nest in colonies of different sizes. And we did this by removing all of the bugs from a nest. We did this with fumigation, an insecticide that I'll get to in a moment. So then it was a clean nest, and we let it go a week. Then we would come back in and we would count how many bugs had appeared on that nest in the intervening week. And then we would zap it again, and we would do this throughout the season. And we did this in colonies of different sizes. And what you see is there are more bugs being introduced to nests each week in the larger colonies. So this is one mechanism we think that causes the increase in parasitism with colony size. more birds visit these big colonies and introduce these bugs. But something's not a cost of coloniality. It's not a cost of living in groups unless it has an effect. It has to affect the fitness of birds that live in groups of different sizes. So to investigate that, we used a fumigation experiment in which we divided the colonies in half and we removed bugs with an insecticide from half of the nests in the colony. And that allowed us to then compare how well the birds did in the absence of parasites and in the presence of parasites in the same colony. And the fumigation, we had to go in there each week and remove them, remove the bugs. And then we looked at survival of babies. We looked at the weight of the babies as a measure of their condition. And we found a very striking result. So these are two babies, two cliff swallow babies that are the same age, but this one on the right is from a nest where the swallow bugs were removed by fumigation. This is from a nest where it had natural numbers of swallow bugs. So this is a tremendous difference, shows a tremendous cost of living with swallow bugs. And this was the kind of difference we would see in the larger colonies. In the smaller colonies where there weren't as many bugs, this difference was not pronounced. So this photo had a major sort of impact on behavioral ecology because it was for many years it was reproduced in textbooks as an example of the cost of parasites. And that's great. It's a very graphic, wonderful illustration. But this work was done in the 1980s. And at the time we thought, well, okay, this is how it is. There's just a tremendous cost of swallow bugs. And we didn't think really a lot more about it for about 25 years. What were we doing during those 25 years? Well, we were catching and banding cliff swallows, which I'll get to that here in a moment. But through all of this time, we kept seeing bugs on nests. These are bugs on nests, and these are babies. And the babies still seemed to be doing okay. They were surviving. The birds were still using these big colonies despite all of these bugs. And so it became sort of we started thinking about it in about 2015, and I started wondering, is what we're seeing in the 1980s, is it really still going on? And about that time, a graduate student at the University of Utah, who had worked with me as an undergraduate, she suggested that what we might be seeing in cliff swallows, given the tremendous cost these animals were paying to parasites, we might be seeing the evolution of tolerance of parasites by this cliff swallow host. Now let's think a moment about how hosts deal with parasites and pathogens. We usually think of dealing with parasites and pathogens by resisting them. We try to avoid getting exposed. Or if we are exposed, we try to reduce the numbers of parasites on us or in us. And this is often We often do this with an immunological response, fever, inflammation. That's how we deal with parasites. But these immunological responses are costly in and of themselves. And oftentimes, some of the worst aspects of dealing with parasites and pathogens comes from our own immune system. So it has been suggested that maybe a better strategy to deal with parasites when they're very, very common and they're unavoidable may be to tolerate them, evolve an ability to tolerate them and not respond to them in the same way that we see with resistance. And the what theoretical biologists think is maybe an advantage of this is that it removes selection on the parasite to evolve counter defenses. If you're not resisting the parasite, then the parasite doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to become more virulent. It doesn't have to evolve different transmission strategies. Now, tolerance of parasites had been well known in plants. I mean, it's really quite well studied there. But as of the mid 2010s, for animals, most of the work on tolerance was theoretical. It was modeling, uh, being tolerant of your parasites versus resisting, and in what circumstances you should do either. So we began thinking, okay, well, if these animals are tolerating their parasites better than they were in the 1980s, we should see less of a cost than we saw in the 1980s. So what I decided to do was to repeat exactly what we had done in the early days of the study. We would do exactly what we did at some of the same sites. We would split up the colonies, fumigate portions, not fumigate portions, check nests, weigh the babies. And it was a tough sell to get money to go back and repeat something that we had done, 30 years earlier. But we did manage to do it. And we got some very, very interesting results. So if we look first at nestling body mass at 10 days, which is what we measured in the 1980s, and we look at fumigated nests in blue and non-fumigated nests in red, we see down here, these were the 1980s. And you see there's a very, very big difference between red and blue in the 1980s. Well, we then had this gap where we didn't have any data. And then when we repeated these experiments in 2015 through 2018, you see that the difference between fumigated nests and non-fumigated nests was much less. Now, this uses all colony sizes and so forth. But what you see is there's far less difference between the nestling body mass of fumigated babies and non-fumigated babies. And that is illustrated most graphically here. We recreated the photo in 2015. And this is a fumigated baby, this is a non-fumigated baby. You see there's very little difference in the effect of parasites 30 years later. And we saw the same thing when we looked at the number. Well, this is a reaction norm graph where we look at the body mass of nestlings in relation to the number of swallow bugs that were found on them. And the point to take away is you can see that nestling body mass in the 80s dropped quite a bit with more parasites. And that slope was much more shallow in the 2010s, indicating that the presence of those bugs had less effect on nestling body mass in the intervening years. So when we looked at the number of young that survived per nest, again in blue fumigated nests, red non-fumigated nests, you can see we had this huge difference in the 1980s. But by 2015, this difference began to disappear. And so again, it looks like the birds are not being nearly as affected by these bugs as they were in the 1980s. And this may explain in part why they've been able to continue to live in these large colonies with bugs. I'm going to return to this issue of parasite tolerance here shortly when we talk about some of the banding and survival studies. Okay, so given these costs of bugs, I mean, maybe they were worse in the 1980s, but there are still costs of living in groups for cliff swallows. There've got to be some advantages. There's got to be something that causes these birds to live in groups. And the three main ones among animals include increased success at avoiding predators. And this can be done in any number of ways, being more vigilant, having group defense, etc. The other one, and the one I'm going to focus on, is an increased ability to exploit prey that's hard to find. And this is the notion of social foraging, that animals can forage together, and in that way, they're able to increase their food intake. Aggregation in a limited habitat, we've more or less um, discarded that a factor for cliff swallows. So in the early days, many behavioral ecologists were interested in information sharing among birds. In fact, it was hypothesized that colonies and roosts might represent information centers where individuals could return to that location, and if they didn't know where food was, they could observe others and follow them out to where food could be found. And this was a very, very popular idea in the 1970s and 1980s, but there was almost no good evidence that animals actually did this. Well, we discovered that cliff swallows do engage in information sharing at their colonies. Birds that have been successful in finding insects, they come back with their mouth full, and those individuals are thereby signaling their success. So an individual that hasn't been successful at finding food, particularly a neighbor, will then be able to follow this guy out to an insect patch on its next trip away from the colony. And the birds seem to use the same cues that we would use. They look to see who comes back with food in their mouth. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment. But if information sharing is a benefit of coloniality, then individuals in bigger groups should have more access to food. They should be able to find food more rapidly, and therefore they would be able to feed their babies more insects. So we looked at that using a method called the ring collaring technique. So in this method, you put a pipe cleaner around the baby's throat, and it prevents the baby from swallowing the food that the parents bring back on a particular foraging trip. And then you can go in, pull out the bolus of food, you can weigh it, you can identify the insects. So we did this at colonies of different sizes, and we found this dramatic result. We found that that foraging success increased with colony size. So this is the amount of food brought back per foraging trip in grams in relation to colony size. And what you see is the birds in the bigger colonies are bringing back considerably more food per foraging trip than those in the smaller colonies. Almost a half gram more per foraging trip in the larger colonies. And this is that translates into a lot of food because these birds may be making 17 trips per hour throughout the day. So, this we were really sort of this was very satisfying because it seemed to indicate that this is a benefit that may compensate these animals for these tremendous costs of swallow bugs and other costs that they endure. So this work was all done in the 80s. And once again, sort of a nice example of foraging, of social foraging, and cliff swallow colonies being an information center. But as we sort of began to rethink our work on parasites, I also began to rethink some of this work that we had been doing with foraging. And what I want to show you is, and I want to make the point that cliff swallows feed in groups on swarms of insects. That's why information sharing seemed to work so well for them. So this is a group. This is a foraging group, basically in our front yard in Nebraska. But you can see there are a fair number of birds in this group, and they feed in these tightly sort of coordinated groups that'll be in one place for a while, and then they'll move someplace else. And this is really remarkable. You can watch these birds feed in groups, and you can score the size of the group, and the groups are distinctive enough that you can score where they're feeding in relation to the colony. And I had done a lot of this in the 1980s. And what we knew was that the birds fed in large groups, typically fed in groups from 50 to 200 birds. But in the mid 2000s, we started saying, I'm not sure these birds are feeding in these big groups anymore. And given the changes in insects that we know have been occurring in some parts of the world, we asked the question, could they be, has their social foraging changed over time? Well, the the big the big answer is yes, because this is a graph showing the percentage of foraging groups or solitaries in the 80s in red versus more recently in blue. And what you find is many of the foraging groups in more recent years are these small groups. The big groups which we had in the 1980s, we're not getting nearly as many of those anymore. So there's been this shift in foraging, just a tremendous shift in foraging behavior. And this is just remarkable. I mean, there's not much out there on other species to suggest, why this might be going on, but it seemed to suggest that the advantages of social foraging now may be less than they were 30 years ago. So that led us to ask, well, has information sharing perhaps changed? So we went back and repeated some of the observations we did in the 80s, where we looked at birds that returned to their nests. Here's a bird that's been successful. It's feeding its baby. Here's a bird that was unsuccessful. It just comes back to the nest, doesn't feed anybody, looks around, and then it will typically leave the nest. And often we found in the 1980s would follow one of these animals out to a patch of insects. And this is what this graph shows from 1984. If you look at the previous trip for birds that came back to their nests, the ones that were unsuccessful almost always followed other individuals when they had been unsuccessful. When they had been previously successful, they tended not to follow others. Okay? Huge difference in the 1980s. So success on the previous trip had a big impact on whether you followed or you didn't follow another individual from the colony on the next trip out. Totally reversed in 2019, for instance. The unsuccessful birds are more likely to not follow others than in the 1980s. And part of this was we determined, well, group foraging is less successful now. If you look at the prey capture rates of birds in big groups now, it's less than it was in the 1980s, and that's maybe why we see fewer big groups. But what this means is that these birds have completely shifted the way that they feed, and in the process, perhaps the benefits of living in groups have also fundamentally changed. You know, we're trying to sort of process what that really means, but it's and it may be related to changes in insects. We can get into that maybe in the questions. We don't really know right now, but I'm not aware of any other species that's shown such a dramatic change in their social foraging over a relatively short time. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about why we get this variation in colony size. Because you might think, well, you got costs of certain colony sizes, you got benefits of certain colony sizes, and maybe there's one colony size that's best. Maybe there's one that where everybody does the best. Or maybe everybody does best in a big colony. So why do you even still see small colonies? So we addressed this sort of fundamental question about why you have variation in group size. And we did it by looking at the net effect of these costs and benefits. The net effect of these costs and benefits is expressed in how the birds survive and how many babies they raise. So all of these things sort of are reflected in these measures. So that led us to ask, okay, if this variation in colony size persists, we still have some large colonies, we still have big colonies, maybe fitness is identical in all the colony sizes. That's one possibility, which seems not terribly likely given the way these costs and benefits vary in sort of nonlinear ways. Or perhaps selection on group size fluctuates in different years. And this is the notion of fluctuating selection. So this idea is that Small colonies are favored in some years, large colonies are favored in other years because of maybe climate and how those affect the different costs and benefits, bugs, feeding, um, and how that plays out in groups of different sizes. So now we already knew that there is a heritable basis to the colony size that these animals occupy. So birds that are born in small colonies tend to live in small colonies. Birds that are born in large colonies live in large colonies. And we showed this with cross-fostering experiments. So colony size preference is a genetically determined trait. And this allows us then to look at how it may be selected for in different years. So in this case, we're focusing on annual survival. So we looked at annual survival for adults in different size colonies, and we calculated a survival selection coefficient for each colony size in each year. And what we would predict would be significant negative and positive coefficients in different years if this fluctuating selection idea actually holds. So in order to do this, we used our 25-year mark recapture program in which we banded over 229,000 birds, and we had over 408,000, almost 408,000 captures of birds in nets. This is the largest mark recapture database for a single species in a single study area that I'm aware of. And we were able to use this to estimate survival and colony choice for thousands of birds with known histories. And we use program mark to generate our survival estimates. At one point, at the height of our banding, we were receiving the most size 1 bands from the banding lab, except for the country of Canada, in which they all went to Canada. So we were really going through the bands when were at the height of this work. So how did we catch all of these birds? Well, the fact that cliff swallows are colonial is one reason. You can catch them when they're at their nests. In this case, we would carry a net out over a bridge. We would throw the net over the side of the bridge. The birds would flush out, get caught in the net. We'd pull it back up, and then we'd carry it over and process it. So we would do that at colonies where we couldn't get to them from below. Other colonies, like these highway culverts, we would just put a set net on one end, at the end in which they were exiting into the wind, and you can catch a lot of cliff swallows at once. So actually processing time, we would have teams of processors to go through all of these birds. So it was possible to catch hundreds of birds per day. Okay, what I want to show you here, these are the directional selection coefficients for different years for colony, for groups on group size. So the negative numbers mean that birds in smaller colonies had higher survival year to year. The positive numbers mean that birds in bigger colonies had higher survival, annual survival. And you can see there's fluctuation. Now the red dots are ones in which the survival coefficient was significantly different from 0. So in those years, there was significant selection on colony size. The green dots were ones where there was either no selection or we didn't have the sample size to measure it. So what you see is that in some years, birds in smaller colonies are favored. In other years, birds in bigger colonies are favored. And this is the fluctuating selection idea that some years the costs and benefits are such it's better to be in a small colony, and other years it's better to be in a big colony. But the fact that selection fluctuates means that these small colony, large colony genotypes, if you will, can persist in the population. Now, you may ask, okay, well, why do you have negative selection coefficients in some years and positive in other years? Are there any sort of climatic um, um, relationships that might explain this? And there is. If you look at the selection coefficient in relation to a drought index, this is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, what you find is that in these wetter, cooler years, which are at the right end of the graph, in those years, birds in bigger colonies appear to be have an advantage. In these dry, um, warm years, birds in smaller colonies appear to be favored. So it could be that just the uh, climatic conditions lead to these changes in selection on colony size, and it makes sense because in these wet dry in these wet sorry these dry hot years you have lots of swallow bugs, so birds in small colonies are not going to do as well. In these wet and cool years, birds in bigger colonies, they don't have to pay the cost of parasites so much, and they can take advantage of foraging in these type of years. So we think that may explain in part why you get this fluctuating selection on group size. Now, I wanted to return for a moment to this issue of tolerance. So we wanted to see if there had been any long-term changes in survival of these birds in relation to parasites. So in this case, we took just the average survival across all colonies for all group sizes, and we looked at it per year from the 80s to 2014. And this first graph is the annual first year survival probability. So in the red are non-fumigated natal colonies. So these are birds from non-fumigated sites. And the blue are fumigated sites. And you see that over time, annual first year survival probability has actually gone up for non-fumigated babies. It's gone up a little bit for the fumigated babies, but not as much. So again, it's consistent with these animals with parasites being less of a cost as we move forward in time. And you see the same thing over here. This is second year survival probability over the years. The birds from non-fumigated breeding colonies that lived in non-fumigated sites, their survival has gone up over time. And if anything, the survival of birds in the fumigated colonies has dropped a little bit. So it gets back to this idea of tolerance and that these effects of these bugs are less pronounced now than they were 30 years ago. Okay, I wanted to say a little bit more, and then we'll end and have time for questions. But I wanted to talk about one behavior that cliff swallows have that's very, very unique. And that is that they often try to exploit their neighbors. And that's one of the advantages or costs of living in a group. It sort of depends on if you're the exploiter or the exploitee. But this can occur in a number of ways. One is through extra pair fertilizations. We know this is common in birds, and this happens in cliff swallows. But where cliff swallows are sort of unusual is that they engage in conspecific brood parasitism. So birds will go next door and they will lay an egg. And in that way, they exploit their neighbor. They often will lay an egg next door, and then that enables them to actually have the parasite will have a normal size clutch of her own. So she ends up adding to her reproductive output. And there are increased opportunities to do this sort of thing if you have more neighbors and if you live in these closely packed colonies. And we discovered, in fact, in the very first year, that cliff swallows lay eggs in neighbors' nests. This maybe isn't surprising, but they also have another way that they parasitize their neighbors. And we discovered this when we would find eggs appear in a nest, and 2, 3 days later they would hatch, which meant, I mean, that's not possible. They had to have been incubated someplace else and then physically moved into that nest. So we got very interested in this, and um, I decided that the most direct way to um, document this sort of movement of eggs would be to number eggs. So we numbered eggs. So as the eggs were appeared in the nest, in this case, this was nest number 4, we would number them with a Sharpie, take them out, number them, put them back in. And then we would return on later days and look to see if anybody showed up in the wrong nest. And it didn't take long to see this. In fact, the first batch of marking we did, we came back 2 days later and we discovered an egg from nest number 6 was in the clutch of nest number 8. And this bird was only two doors down, so to speak. So of course, we got very excited, took the eggs out, we photographed them, and in that way, we documented that the birds also move eggs around. The advantage of moving an egg instead of laying an egg is you have a much wider window of time when a nest can be parasitized. If you're going to lay an egg, you got to synchronize your egg laying with when the host lays her eggs. But moving the eggs around, you have a much longer window. And it turned out that the nests that had eggs moved into them were also the nests that had fewer swallow bugs within the colony. So there was a relationship between being parasitized via egg transfer and being parasitized by swallow bugs. So it appears that the birds may be assessing their neighbors, and when their neighbors don't have as many parasites as they do, they move an egg. And in that way, at least some of the offspring will be raised in a relatively parasite-free nest. So it's a very sophisticated reproductive strategy that it's been reported in a couple of other bird species. We estimate at least 6% of nests have eggs moved into them. I've seen it actually happen, I think, 5 times in 45 years. So it's a rare process, but it does happen. So I think at this point I want to stop and give us time to answer any questions that folks have. I hope I've conveyed how the complexity of social living in these animals and also the changing nature of social evolution and how oftentimes what we thought we understood 30 years ago, uh, not so much anymore. So for those scientists out there, I guess the cautionary tale is don't temporally replicate your work because you may find that things have changed an awful lot in the intervening years. Okay, so I think at that point I will stop and um, should I stop sharing at this point?
It doesn't really matter. Sure. Yeah. That's, again, just fascinating research. So we found the evolution of a tolerance to parasites, to the swallow bug. So a
Correct,
couple
correct.
questions surrounding that. I would wonder, is anyone looking at any DNA and using DNA analysis to try to measure that? Is that measurable?
Well, the mechanism for the tolerance is a tough one um, because we don't have the appropriate samples.
Hmm.
I mean, there are a lot of physiological measures you could do now on the current birds,
Hmm.
um, and uh, but we can't go back in time
Right.
and look at ones from the 1980s.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Now, there are DNA, we can get DNA from specimens and so forth. But a lot of what we would like to do in terms of the mechanisms of tolerance, we just don't have the material
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
the birds
Okay.
from those years.
I didn't catch whether you said the swallow bug populations have been increasing. Have they been increasing with heat, with climate change? Or?
They actually have not been. They've been largely stable over the 30 years of the study.
Hmm.
Uh, and that would be another interpretation for our results. If the numbers of bugs have gone down, then maybe you would expect less effect on them. But in sampling these bugs with the same method, we found that the populations are stable. Now, there's reason to believe that with warmer winters, these bugs may overwinter less successfully. They require a period of cold weather because they got to shut down while the birds are gone. And if it gets too warm in the winter, then they may not be able to survive until the birds return. And we've done some experiments that show that as overwintering temperatures increase, bug survival is going to go down. So it could be that over time, these birds are going to have fewer bugs because of the winter climate.
Hmm. Okay. So the survival there's a fluctuation in survival, and you
Right,
said that wet years they tend to be in larger colonies, and dry years they're in smaller colonies.
right.
So I was just wondering what's been happening to the environment around the study site in terms of its habitat. Has it changed to become more agricultural? Has it been urbanized? What are we seeing there as well?
Well, that's one of the great advantages of having picked this site because it's almost unchanged
Mhm.
since the 1980s. Now they have brought in a few areas, they brought in more corn cultivation, converted ranching land to corn. But urbanization hasn't changed. I mean, the population of the county is about the same as it was in the 1980s. So the environment, the measurable aspects of the environment
Mhm.
really haven't changed
Mhm.
during this period of time. Surely insects have changed, but the problem is we don't have good data from the 1980s on insect abundance. Now we do know that the qualitative, we know the major families that the birds were taking in the 1980s. And we know the major families they were taking today, and they're the same. The three most common are the same today as they were in the 1980s. So qualitatively, it doesn't look like any change. But but clearly there something is going on with insects. The distribution is changing because the foraging is just they've made this tremendous shift in foraging.
I know a lot of people are concerned about the pipe cleaner method, so could you just give us some
Right.
information on that before we move on?
Right. Yeah, we do that, and it's a safe method. You loosely fit it around the baby,
Mhm,
and at most you're robbing the baby of one meal.
mhm,
Uh, and we were careful not to do it too tight.
mhm.
Um, if anything, we erred on having it too loose, and then you lose the food.
Yeah. And you're fully
Uh,
permitted, and
oh
there's
yeah, right,
procedures
yeah,
y'all have to
right.
follow, and you have to
Right.
monitor kills and all
Right.
of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of that is, I cooked and
Yeah.
but this is a method that goes back to the 60s. It was first used on blackbirds by
Mhm,
Gordonians in the 1960s.
mhm.
Um,
Okay.
and it's the only way I've tried to sample insects directly, and it's hopeless
Mhm,
with
mhm,
cliff swallows because they feed on all these things up high off the ground. The
mhm.
only way we can get any information on what they're eating is from these ring
Yeah.
collar samples.
Yeah. So overall, the populations, what does the overall population tell us about their numbers again?
With cliff swallows, nationally, their population, they're going down in some areas. In the Great Plains, they're stable or increasing. They had been increasing throughout the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s.
Hmm.
We're seeing them now in areas that they formerly didn't occur.
Hmm.
They moved into areas in Tulsa in the last 30 years, so they're common breeding bird in Tulsa now. They
Hmm.
didn't used to be. So they've colonized a lot of areas. I don't know what the actual breeding bird survey shows, but they've moved into many new areas through
Hmm.
Great Plains and in some parts of the East. But then you'll have places like San Juan Capistrano in California where the numbers have gone down. And what's going on there, it may be forestation of the landscape. These birds don't like forests.
Hmm.
But unlike most of the other swallows that are not doing well population wise, cliff swallows are 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 stable.
Glad to
They're
hear it.
not increasing.
Okay. Would it be safe to assume the foraging findings about the cliff swallows would apply to bank swallows?
That's a great question. I had a student that studied social foraging in bank swallows in the 1980s, and she could find no evidence that those animals forage socially. So it appeared that bank swallows might be forming colonies for reasons unrelated to food, perhaps anti-predator advantages, which was what Hoagland and Sherman had concluded back in the 70s. So they didn't forage socially in the 80s, so it's hard to say what's going on with bank swallows.
Hmm.
Their numbers are, they're really going down.
Yeah.
We've lost almost all of our colonies in western Nebraska.
All right. So the questions kind of aren't in a particular order, so I might bounce back and forth a bit. When you suggest a parasite tolerance, could it have been vertically transmittable or transmissible is how it's spelled. Transmissible? Is that a word? Immunological resistance? Transmissible immunological resistance.
Well, it could be some sort of mother offspring, because
Hmm.
that's typically what vertical transmission refers to.
Okay.
Um, it's possible and we know that there are studies that show that cliff swallows have antibodies to swallow bugs. So
Mhm.
it's possible that the immune response, either through vertical transmission or otherwise, is different now, so that the babies are being better compensated through vertical transmission, perhaps in the egg, than in the 1980s. That would be a possible shift. that could explain this. But
Mhm.
again, we don't have anything from the 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a good hypothesis, yeah.
Get out there and do field research, kids.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go back in time. That's what we need,
Yeah.
a time machine.
Yeah, speaking of time, so we've got 10 more minutes or so. I do want to wrap around to conservation at the end. One of my last questions, I want to focus on conservation, but let's go with some of these more science questions. Somebody wanted to know the name of the professor who did the studies on the bank swallows mentioned at the beginning of the lecture.
John Hoagland and Paul Sherman.
Okay. Um, Forage group numbers have diminished. Is that connected to the overall populations of the species as well, or are numbers stable?
What was the first part of that?
Forage group numbers have
Foraging
diminished.
group, yeah. Well, we have not seen any, we've seen no change in our study area. And
Mhm,
we have pretty good, I mean, we census all the colonies in the study,
mhm,
and,
mhm.
100,000 nests or whatever every year. We
Yeah.
haven't seen any evidence that numbers have gone down.
Mhm, mhm,
So, and these foraging observations were done in colonies of similar size to the 1980s. So we tried to control for that by by where we conducted the observations.
mhm,
Um, it's one of them. It's probably the single most striking thing that I have seen in 45 years
yeah.
is this shift in foraging behavior.
Mhm,
It's just you can't convey how um, what a change that's been.
mhm. Yeah. Are there any other, what are your other biggest surprises that this study has revealed to you as you got into it?
Well, the how rapidly evolution can work. Now, I didn't talk about some of the roadkill stuff. That's another aspect of this study where we looked at the birds being killed on roads, found that the incidence of roadkill mortality has gone down over time, and that's been associated with shorter wings that have developed in this population.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we think the shorter wings have been partly in response to road-associated mortality, but it may also be partly in response, everything in ecology is complicated. It may be partly in response to changes in foraging behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen over time, we've seen this drastic decrease in road mortality, along with these morphological changes. We've seen a lot of morphological change that's been associated with bad weather events. So we in 1996 we had this famous event that wiped out 53% of the population over 6 days, and the it was like Herman Bumpus and the house sparrows all over again.
Mm-hmm.
We saw a major shift in the body metrics of these birds.
Wow.
They became bigger skeletally, but they ended up having shorter wings and shorter tails
Mm-hmm.
over a 6 day period. So those trends have been maintained since that event.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a sort of one of these evolutionary catalysts
Right.
to long-term change.
Yeah.
So you can see these evolutionary or phenotypic changes that occur over relatively short periods of time.
Mm-hmm. And with the coming onslaught of major catalytic storms,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, what happens next to this species and other social species and um,
that's a great question because these catastrophic events are expected to increase.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the conservation. There's so many other questions, we can't get to them all, but I'm interested to know. There are people who love swallows, love swifts. They love to celebrate their return every year. When it comes to some of these swallow species in general, what is the conservation outlook? What can people do? What's being done today by various groups to support their populations?
Well, of course, purple martins have a national following,
Mhm,
and there are various groups that support the maintenance of martin colonies and management strategies to maintain successful martin colonies. But
mhm,
there's very little else for the other swallows. Now, in Massachusetts, Mara Silver has been conducting a swallow conservation effort there
mhm,
to promote uh, birds and to try to get promote awareness so that landowners are not going in and removing nests from barns and other places where the birds occur. Populations in the Northeast of cliff swallows are relatively small, but they're entirely dependent on these barns up there. And for some reason, the Northeast population uses mostly buildings instead of bridges. Um, but there's no national coordinated effort to um, um, encourage or maintain colonies.
mhm,
And usually the questions I get are, how can I get rid of these birds?
mhm.
Because they're messy and so you've got to somehow people want to can we put them on another structure? Can we build another structure that they'll use? Well, we don't have any we don't have any good evidence that that's going to work. I mean, we're trying out certain things. Mara and I are experimenting, and others have experimented, but there's no guaranteed structure, cliff swallow nesting structure. Then we can tell people, oh well, you can get them, you can move them off your building onto this.
Yeah, perhaps we could evolve human tolerance of the cliff swallow.
Yeah, that might be a little bit better. But the other swallows, yeah, there's no coordinated conservation.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's thought that changes in flying insects are causing these population declines. Although the evidence for that, I don't see any strong evidence that that is directly related
Hmm.
to the population declines.
Okay.
Number one, because the data on insects are not very good.
Right, right, right. And I know Mara Silver's in the audience, so thank you for joining us, Mara. I think it's a good time to talk about your upcoming book. Can you tell us what that's going to focus on?
I have a book that's in press with the University of Nebraska Press. It's called Cliff Swallow Societies, A Journey in Social Evolution. It's going to be a non-technical account of the 45 years. It's going to hit on all of the
Mhm.
important points. I think it will be of use to both biologists and also um, other people that are interested in science and natural history. What I'm trying to do in this is convey how cool it has been to work on this same animal for so long and how one discovery leads to another discovery and
Mhm,
so forth. So
mhm.
I hope that it'll offer a sort of a vicarious opportunity to experience a long-term field project.
Great. And
And
see
the
the
book,
title
yeah, it will be called provisionally Cliff Swallow Societies,
published by the University of
University of
Nebraska
Nebraska Press. Yeah.
and expected when?
Late 26 or possibly 27.
Okay. Now's a good time for us to drop those links in the chat. You mentioned in the Swallow websites that people can follow.
Right. Uh, our project, our 45-year project, you can access it at cliffswallow.org. And all of the papers are there if you want to access the papers. We
Hmm.
have photos, other information about our research and the bird. We have photos of alternative sites that people have tried with mixed success.
Hmm.
And then Mara has a site. Um, I think it's swallowconservation.org, which is focused on cliff and barn swallow conservation primarily in the Northeast.
Okay, great. Um, I guess in Europe, they build artificial banks for sand martins. Well, that's nice.
Oh,
There's so much we can do. People just need
we
to
can, yeah,
be
yeah,
creative, right?
right.
Um, I know that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Nest Watch site has some information on barn swallow nest boxes. I haven't read myself to see how successful they are, but I'll certainly be trying it here where I live because we're trying to move them from the garage to the outside, and I want to start experimenting with that. I think we have to wrap up now, but I really appreciate you being here and sharing
There,
your research with us. I think it's
there are
fascinating. Yeah,
great questions in the in the chat,
there
and
are.
I would be happy to continue this conversation.
Hmm.
You could send me your question at charles-brown at utulsa.edu,
Hmm.
and I would be happy to answer them because there are a lot there that I would like uh,
Absolutely. And I will
to
also send you these so you can read them later. But could you give that email one more time?
Charles-Brown at utulsa.edu.
Okay, great. And everybody can tune into this on the YouTube site in a few days, perhaps as early as tomorrow, but I'm not sure. And then let's see, next month on November 13th, we're having a taxonomy webinar. So join us for that, our annual taxonomy webinar. And in December, we're having a Spanish only webinar where we've invited a Colombian conservation organization called SOC. Um, my Spanish is bad, but I'll give it a try. The Sociedad Ornitológica de Córdoba. I think that's about it. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next month. And thank you, Charles, again. Have a great day.
Thank you.